everyone. Welcome to the webinar session hosted by Chettinad School of Law on navigating the contours of disability law in India. I am R. Tushara, currently pursuing my BBA LLB honors at Chettinad School of Law, and I will be a moderator for this session. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Ms. Isha Khurana. Thank you so much, ma'am, for being here with us. To briefly introduce Ms. Isha Khurana, she is a legal specialist at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi and is currently working on the project Scaling City Institutions for India. At CPR, she has been engaged in providing consultancy on the legislative and regulatory framework for studies across WASH and land and housing planning thematic areas. Her current work at CPR comprises of drafting and proposing various legislative measures for better regulation of the sanitation and land and housing at state or municipal level across various states. Ms. Isha is currently pursuing her doctoral research in disability rights law from Indian Law Institute, Disability in New Delhi. Her research is on legal framework for mentally disabled in India and with the sole objective to understand and assess the implementation of the rights framework for mentally disabled in India. I'm so honored and happy to have you here with us, ma'am, amidst the busy schedule. Much, ma'am. Before we proceed with the session, I would like to briefly introduce Chettinad School of Law. The Chettinad Group, with over 60 years of education, have been pioneers in providing a progressive learning environment across Tamil Nadu. They are currently responsible for over 12,000 students in 22 private, government-aided schools and colleges for medicine, dentistry, engineering, law, physiotherapy, nursing, architecture, allied health sciences, and pharmaceutical sciences. The Chettinad School of Law is recognized by BCI and approved by the UGC and provides an environment that provides high quality education through active learning, provides an environment that provides experienced faculty and exposure through legal internships. The School of Law is a member of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law and the International Association of Law Schools. Before handing over the session to the guest speaker, I would like to tell a few pointers to the participants. You are requested to kindly mute your audio. There will be a question answer session at the end of the webinar. You can post your questions in the chat box. You can even post your questions during the middle of the webinar also. Thank you, ma'am. The floor is all yours, ma'am.
Thank you, Tushara, for such a wonderful introduction. And also thank you, Ruchi and Shamtanu, sir. So I have a long association with both of them. We were colleagues at one point of time, and it was really fun to work with them. So coming here to deliver a guest lecture to these students, to all of you, is really a pleasure. And thank you so much, Ruchi, for actually approaching me at this time. Ruchi. So before we start into my presentation, there are very few basic concepts about disability that all of us are aware about and yet we choose to ignore. A few of them being that a huge number of people in the country and also worldwide are people who suffer or are with disability. It's my wrong to say use the word suffer actually, but are with people with disability. And when I say that with stats in my mind. So as per the statistics of the census in 2011, around 2.21% of 2.21% of the total population of India at that time was suffering from, were disabled as per the census of 2011. What is important here is that was as per the 1995 legislation, which has been amended as of date. So the number of people who are disabled in country at the present moment, as per the new legislation, labeled as per the new legislation, would be very, very high. And yet, we choose to ignore them. We choose to not give them their rights. We choose to, let's just say, make them feel discriminate against them, do not give them equality rights. So those are the problems that we have actually faced or seen people with disability facing. And I say that with a lot of pinch of salts when we say that people with disability have been ignored, have been invisible citizens of the country. That is so because even the parent legislation of ours have always been ignorant or not giving them due importance. People with disabilities have not been recognized in those legislations. One thing very important again here to mention is that there have been times of for let's say a person with disability has the potential to impact at least four other people who are not with disability. What I mean to say is that if I have personally a disability, my family members will have to adapt to my needs. So that's another thing. In spite of that huge strata of people being affected by disability, also their near ones, their relatives being impacted by disability, still we choose to treat disability more like a stigma, more like labeling, more like a medical condition rather than treating them as a social or let's say rights condition. And why I say social and rights condition is when we come to the next part. Okay, so I also understand that in this entire group, we might not be very much well versed with the entire concepts of rights and duties as per the jurisprudence. So, just to give you a background of it, all of us are aware that everyone has a human right. All of us have fundamental rights as the citizens of the country. But these fundamental rights, these human rights, have been recognized for different genres of people. For example, the women and children have been recognized, have been given special status, affirmative action that we talk about, because they were not at equal footing initially, or people because of caste were not at equal footing initially. So we give them reservations. That is an affirmative action. But when it comes to persons with disability, it was not as easy as it was for people with the, let's say, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and caste and gender problems. They also had a long struggle to go by, but persons with disability has had a longer struggle because till let's say 2006, 2008, there were almost an invisible segment of people whom we used to refuse to recognize. Before we go on to the constitutional aspects of it, we need to understand what is disability. So, internationally, we have three models that talk about disability. One of them is a medical model, which perceives disability as a deviation from normal. Now, we humans at different junctures have set a parameters of what is normal and what is abnormal. So, any deviation from that is considered to be a disability. Having two legs and walking on them is a normal situation. But in situation a person is having a locomotor disability or using wheelchair or having paralysis, that will be a deviation and we will say it's a disability. And disability entails with itself a charity approach. It's a medical condition and people should pity the person. The medicines should be used so as to overcome that disability. It's not about making good or whatever we have, it's rather that we try to overcome the disability by use of medicines, by use of other appliances and everything. That is the medical model of disability. Just to give you an example, for example, with respect to mental disability, you guys might have heard about this instance that if a person happens to be suffering from schizophrenia, at least in interiors of North India, we have all of these tantrics and babas coming to the places and trying to do a lot of black magic to get rid of, let's say, whatever witch or the concepts are in the rural interiors. So that is because we believe that that's a deviation from normal. That is because we believe there's a stigma attached to mental disability. And once that doesn't happen, we go to a doctor. The doctor tries to give you medicines and tries to cure you. So, with respect to mental disability, it might just try to curtail your violent behavior, but when it comes to physical disability, there are less chances of it. For example, if a person again is visually impaired, no amount of medicines, there are times when no amount of medicines can actually get back the light in your eyes. So, in those situations, we have to make peace with it and also try to make our surroundings and environment barrier free for a person with visual impairment. And that brings us to the second model, that's called a social model, which says disability is one part. Deviation from, as the medical model says, deviation from normal is one part. But the major hindrance is our environmental and social barriers that we have created. Those are the barriers which make a person impaired, which make a person disabled. A person is born as it is, but the surroundings make him a disabled person. For example, a person who has locomotor disability uses a wheelchair to move around or maybe a support system to move around. But when it comes to multi-story buildings, he realizes that there are no lifts, there are no elevators, there are no ramps, but just stairs. So this person who uses a wheelchair becomes a disabled now. Initially, he was a fully abled person who could move around in the country, maybe more faster than we are. And just to share on the very same thought, I have met stalwarts in disability law who have been working on disability rights, who use wheelchairs, and when they use their wheelchair, they're faster than me running. So that's just because they have mastered the art of using the wheelchair, and there are no per se hindrances in the environment that they move the wheelchair in. But if we do not have, if we create a barrier, if we create an environment or if we create infrastructure with barriers, then that can be a problem. Another example would be, so I happen to go to a psychiatric institution, that's an asylum that we call. So in that psychiatric institution, there were floors where the psychiatric patients were housed into. And in all those floors, there were no lifts. There were just stairs and stairs and stairs. A two-story building it was, and there were just stairs in those buildings. The problem being that if one of them ends up hurting his foot or is actually a locomotive disability person, then how will he climb down the stairs or how will he climb up the stairs? If there is an earthquake, a natural calamity like earthquake, or maybe a disaster like fire outbreak, how do they expect a person to run at that moment to save his or her life? Right? There is more important things. One is environment barriers that we actually create. Others infrastructure barriers that we create. Also, there are attitudinal barriers that we have. In our attitude, we have a barrier that if he is locomotor disabled, then he might not be able to walk properly. If he is visually impaired, that means there's something wrong, or maybe his senses or his perception might be just not right. If he's not able to listen, has an audio problem, so maybe his understanding is impaired. Maybe he's not even capable to make decisions. Those are the disabling institutions, attitudes, and environments that we have around us. And social model says that these environments, attitudes, and institutions make a person disabled. It's not about being born with all the organs. It's about how the society and how are we reacting and adapting our society to it that makes them disabled. Social model further emphasizes that there's a need to change the society and the environment and the infrastructure so that everyone is, let's say, able to function to the best of their capabilities. There is a concept, not a concept actually, but there is something that's very hard hitting for all of us, and that is all of us are potentially disabled. Today we have two legs, two hands, and fully functional all six senses. But tomorrow there can be a situation where one of our senses, or more than one of our senses, is not working properly. One of the biggest examples of it is old age. So, old age ends up impairing a few of our senses, and that's a very normal scenario. When those things happen, in old age. That is when we have an acquired disability. So, one of the major things that we should understand and we should always realize is that everyone is potentially disabled. You, me, everyone. Everyone is potentially disabled. Moving to the next model, that is the human rights model. So, the human rights model is exactly the model on which our present day legislations in the country are based on. That says that human rights have been denied to disabled people for a long time. And when I say that, what do I mean? A person is mentally disabled. Mentally disabled can be a person with schizophrenia, can be a person with depression, can be a person with the bipolar disorder, and can be a person with even dementia. So all of these sound like a very heavy medical terms, but in some of the other sense, they would mean that the behavior is in the medical sense again a deviation from the normal behavior. Schizophrenia, or let's say dementia. Dementia is a problem wherein the person ends up forgetting. So a person with dementia might have a problem with remembering things, but he's fully capable to make decisions for himself. Maybe not as grave as where does he want to go, but maybe as small as what does he want to eat, what does he want to wear, and so on and so forth. So those decisions can be made with people with disabilities or even with mental disability, but we have denied those rights to them. That is one example. Second example we can talk about is when we say denial of basic human rights, access to information. Information available in print media that is already typed might not be accessible for a person who has visual impairment. That is a denial of information to that person, which will in turn going to hamper his freedom of expression and choice. When you don't have information, when you do not have knowledge, how can you say that you are free to make a choice or you're free to have express yourself? So those are a few basic human rights that you might just say denied. Right to life, that has also been denied to people with disability. The right to life obviously doesn't mean a mere animal existence as per our constitution and as per the Supreme Court of India. But we can say that denial of basic life, right to life, when we talk about that, if we are making a person who is solely dependent on others for movement, that is not a dignified life. That is more like a charity approach, as was the medical model saying. Again, an example for that would be I see a person moving around with who's visually impaired, moving around, trying to move around with a stick and trying to move on a tactile path on a metro station. That's trying to make him fully independent, that he can move around the station, navigate on him all by himself, and reach to the metro. But if there was no tactile path, and if the entire infrastructure was not made in that manner, there would have been a person who was helping him out. And at the outset, whosoever is seeing, the third person might feel, oh, the second one is so nice, he's helping the person who's visually impaired. But it's not helping, it's more like pity, it's more like charity. What we want is independent living. The person is able to take care of himself. He does not need support from others because of his impairment. He does not need to be called a disabled because of his impairment. And that is what human rights model talks about. And that is what our present day legislations of Right of Persons with Disability Act 2016 and Mental Health Care Act 2017 talks about. I hope I'm making sense to at least a few people. And this not being an interactive session is always a problem because I don't understand how many people are actually understanding what I'm saying. Because I can always go on to explain more and tell more examples about it. So just to illustrate what I have been saying, we need to understand disability in Indian context also. So in India, It's not as simple as the person is a disabled person and that's it. Full stop. That's the end of it. In India, we have things called as cultural impediments, wherein the beliefs and stereotypes play a very, very important role. And when I say beliefs and stereotypes, it is the blanket labeling that I'm talking about. The blanket labeling of incompetence that I'm talking about. The belief that it's an outcome of our old acts, the sins that the person has done, that in this birth the person has been born impaired. Those are the beliefs that I'm talking about. So those cultural impediments make the entire society, or let's say a segment of society, behave in a seclusionistic manner towards the person who's having a disability. In the same vein, we can say that there are social impediments like caste, class, gender, ethnicity, race. All of these are very much resounding in India. Caste, all of us know this, that caste actually has a huge role to play whenever there's any social economic dynamics or social legal dynamics that is played into. The class, caste, and gender, as I was saying, the race, the ethnicity, all of these aggravate the entire situation for a person with disability. Example on point would be a woman with disability. A woman with disability have been long denied their reproductive rights, their rights to make reproductive choices. Forced abortions, sterilizations have been a very common phenomena worldwide, leave aside India. And in India, we can always quote the case that happened in Chandigarh, wherein Suchitra Srivastava, wherein one of the inmates, or one of the persons who was there in the asylum, in the psychiatric hospital, she was raped by a worker in the hospital itself. She ended up being pregnant, conceiving, and the Nari Niketan at that moment, that's the psychiatric institution where she was staying, the Nari Niketan actually wanted her to go for an abortion because who will take care of the child when you yourself are not mentally fit to take care of yourself? The entire petition moved on, went into the Haryana, Punjab, and Haryana High Court, Chandigarh High Court, went to the Supreme Court, and finally the judgment came wherein it was said that it is going to be the woman's choice. So that is a reproductive right that all of us as women have it. But a women with disabilities have been denied for a long time. So those are what we call as multiple vulnerabilities. Children are another segment of people who have been denied because children with disabilities have been denied their right to education, and their right to play, their right to information has been denied to them for a long time. So there are social impediments that play or aggravate or make it multifaceted disability for them. Another segment would be structural impediments. So concepts like as poverty, lack of development, illiteracy, unemployment, though they are a vicious circle that move around, but they contribute to to a person being labeled as disabled because his impairments get aggravated because of poverty. Since he's poor, so he can't go ahead and fetch a wheelchair, let's say. Since he cannot have a wheelchair, he can't go ahead and get education because there's problem with movement. He does not have education, he does not have skill development, he cannot get an employment, there's unemployment, and then there's lack of development. So these social, cultural, and structural impediments, all three of them are basically a vicious circle, which there is no end when it comes to disabled people. All of not I can't say all of the disabled people, but most of the disabled people actually go through all of them at some or the other points in their life. In my interactions with people who hail from economically well-off background but are disabled in the societal sense, or as per the 2016 legislation, they have said that no matter what happens, the social and the cultural impediments, they have to always face them. There would always be remarks which just are filled with pity and more of charity, that how will you survive? What will happen to you? That is not what we talk about. That is not what the disabled ones want. Moving on, so as I was saying with about the human rights framework, so this human rights framework in India came to into the part in 2016. That's when we had our first legislation framed in the human rights framework. Prior to that, we had a host of legislations when it comes to other aspects that the that was supposed to be governed by law, but the disabled were not having any such legislation. Even our most important, the parent document for the country, the constitution, does not mention disability in its full bloom. Like, let's say, the fundamental rights. We have all the fundamental rights, but none of the fundamental rights in the part 3 mention disability as a ground for, let's say, reservation or any kind of affirmative action. The important part here is that in spite of absence in the Constitution of India, the Supreme Court had at various occasions stepped up to the occasion and said that no, the backward classes, the weaker sections, these would include persons with disability also. So, in right to equality and non discrimination, that's one of the fundamental rights that we have in the country. In that, in a very famous judgment, landmark judgment, Indira Savande and versus Union of India, 1992, that's called as the Mandal Commission, Mandal judgment. So, in that judgment, it was said that the backward classes also include persons with disability under Article 15 and 16 of the Constitution. So that's for the first time when actually there was a mention of inclusion of persons with disability for any kind of affirmative action. Further, the directive principles of the state policy. So as I was mentioning a while back, when there is a right, there has to be a corresponding duty also. That's the part of the jurisprudence. The jurisprudential studies say a right is always coupled with a corresponding duty. So if I have a right, there'll be duties on someone else to protect my right. So those are directive principles of state policy. So so those duties we can actually say as directive principles of state policy in our constitution. So the state means the nation or the state government or the central government. They are duty bound to protect our fundamental rights and also to accord certain benefits to us. Right? So since we have a fundamental right of equality and non-discrimination, the state has a duty to ensure that the right to equality and non-discrimination is not infringed. Similarly, in the Directive Principles of State Policy, Article 21 mentions that acquired disability, the word that it uses acquired disability, something that I was mentioning a while back, that all of us are potentially disabled. You and I can acquire a disability in due course of time. So that is acquired disability that Article 41 talks about is that acquired disability can be one of the grounds on which the state should, within the limits of economic capacity and development, make provisions for securing right to work, education, and public assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, and sickness. Meaning thereby that under Article 41, they recognize that there can be a acquired disability. What they have still not recognized is there can be people who are born with impairments, right? There can be disability, there can be disabling environments also. They haven't yet recognized that. but they have recognized the concept of acquired disability due to old age, sickness, right? So they say that acquired in situations of acquired disability, the state would try to, within its economic capacity, to provide employment, right to work, education, and public assistance. That's a good directive principle for state policy, which is imposing an obligation on the state. Now that's a different story how much of that is being implemented in today's, even in today's time. In 1976, there was an amendment wherein Article 38 capital A was added. It said that there should be free legal aid for all the citizens, and any citizen should not be denied legal aid, free legal aid, or legal aid because of the reason of economic or any other disabilities. So again, it's a very widely used term that they've used here is disabilities, other disabilities. So if you are not economically well off or there are any other disabilities that you are incurring or facing, you would not be denied free legal aid. And with that, that's all that our constitution mentions about disabled people, which is, to be honest, in such a our constitution, one of the lengthiest constitution of the world, it is so less of how much or how many people have been or would be affected by disability, directly by disability, indirectly by disability, disability by association. So because so many people can be or have potentially can be impacted by disability, still it's such a only three times mention of the word disability, actually like twice, and the first is the interpretation by the courts. That is really, really disheartening, specifically when it comes to fundamental rights. That absence of mention of word disability or rights for person with disability is very disheartening when we talk about in fundamental rights. Moving on, so disability law has been formulated. So here I try to trace down the evolution and formulation disability law in India. Something important and noteworthy is that disability law in the present time, 2016 legislation, talks about 21 categories of disability, including intellectual disability, that includes autism, dyslexia, but this is this has to be read with mental disability in case you're sorry mental health care act in case you're specifically targeting or talking about mental disability anywhere. Okay, before I move on, I would like to see a few questions, and I would like to answer those few questions that actually I can see right now on my screen. So one of the question is, how does world population affect the law? When you talk about the world population, uh, in the present Indian scenario, obviously we are not concerned with the world population. We bring the stats of the world population here because internationally also till 2006, that's when our international convention comes into picture, there were not much talk about the rights of persons with disability. Again, till 2006, there were not many talks about it. So we can understand that even in the world scenario, they were largely forming a part of this invisible group, or invisible, they were invisible to the entire world altogether. So that's why we mentioned the world population also. Our Indian law, as I was about to say in my this slide was, the present our Indian law, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, is primarily based on this international convention called as United Nations Convention for Rights of Persons with Disability that was formulated in 2006 and subsequently came into force in 2008. So our legislation is primarily based on this international document, and we are obviously a signatory to it without any reservations. So that's why it's important to understand that at the world level also, we had the situation was not much different. There's some countries who might have been better than us, but the situation was not much different. There's another question that asks me how beneficial is the reservation policy for disabled in the government sector? Well, I'd like to come to that question after some time when we discuss the entire thing because it's a very huge topic of discussion and debate because the entire affirmative action of the state always is the reservation policy. So we will like to discuss that later. There's another question that says that is disability law only in concern with disabled person or else with people who are disabled in situations like inability to education, inability to get employment. Well, when you talk about situations like inability to education or inability to get employment, what my understanding from your question is that you're talking about non-inclusive education. Well, children with disability have long been arguing at various forums, people who advocate the rights for children with disability, that the education should be more inclusive in its nature. And when I say inclusive in its nature, meaning we should always keep in mind that there could be people in the class of the students who have intellectual impairments also, like autism, like dyslexia. So the teachers or the educator must be trained enough to catch that and maybe remedy the situation if possible, or maybe provide the education in a manner that's more inclusive that keeps everyone in mind. That is one situation. Inability to get employment is not a disability, I would say. That's unemployment. That's not a disability. Now, if because of a disability you are unable to get an employment, that is another genre of discussion altogether, which is a true fact because there have been instances, there has been direct discrimination on all of those fronts. And that is when, as the last question asked me, the reservation policy for disabled in the government sector. That is when this reservation policy might just be, and I very conservatively use the words might because there have always been disputes. The stats, the studies have always shown to be on the different side. So the word might is just used. Moving on to the next question that I can see is will bringing about reservation policy in the private sector like the one in the government sector be beneficial to the members of the disabled community in the long run? Oh, see, on this question, specifically when it comes to the private sector and also the government sector, reservation policy always has its pros and cons. So we need to weigh our options. What is most beneficial, which has the least advantages possible. And from there, we can actually take whether the reservation policy in the private sector would be beneficial or not. But in my opinion, any reservation policy is not for long. Reservation is kind of an equal footing that you're trying to give to people who have been discriminated against, who have been wronged for a long time. But that is a remedy for a problem or for a societal or let's say attitudinal change. I don't think so. So that is one way where we're trying to do good to the wrong that has been done to them. But we're not remedying the wrong. You understand? They are two different things. We're trying to make good of the wrongs that we have done in past. But that is not going to help the future wrongs that we're going to do or we might be doing. Rather, we should go for more inclusive education, more skill development, societal attitudinal change, wherein the reservation idea doesn't even pop up. You give them jobs just like that. Someone had texted me that my voice is breaking. I hope it's going to be fine now. Going back,
It's fine, Isha. We can continue with because a lot of questions are popping up. Okay, so we'll have that section also in the end. So now I guess you can continue so that like we can take up the questions at the end as well.
okay, yeah. Thank you, Ruchi.
Thank you.
So, moving on to evolution and formulation of disability law, I also realize the time we might be running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go to the basics and most important parts of the presentation which are still there. One of them being that in 1995 we had an act that was the first act which talked about disabled, that was the Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act. Then came the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability in 2006, and India was a signatory to it. So, being a signatory to it, we were obligated to amend our national law, our domestic law, in tune with the convention, and therefore we came up with the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. This act is a much welcome change when it comes to people with disability, because as I was mentioning earlier, human rights approach has been adopted in this legislation. So, and there are a lot of new concepts that have been actually incorporated, which were not there in our 1995 legislation. Equality and non-discrimination was one of the concepts. It was there, but the ambit has been broadened right now. There's a wider ambit of things that we actually cover in equality and non-discrimination clause here. There's a concept of accessibility that we have right now. There's a concept of women and children with disabilities, specific concept of them. We have concepts of reasonable accommodation. We have concepts like legal capacity. So there are a huge chunk of concepts out here. But we're just going to cover, I'm going to try to cover these three so that you get a basic understanding of what it is and what the legislation talks about. Under section 3, which has a marginal heading called as equality and non-discrimination, it says that every person has the, sorry, it doesn't say every person, it says, just give me a second please. Yeah, it imposes a duty on the appropriate government that persons with disability shall enjoy the right to equality, life with dignity, and respect for their his or her integrity equally with others. So, if you see the words that they've used, that's the choicest of words that they've used actually. Right to equality, life with dignity, respect for his or her integrity. So you can understand, or you can try to see it, how much wrong might have been done to them that they talk about respect for his or her integrity, that to equally with others. So they also accept in the very first line that there has been discrimination in the past, which we do not want any longer. This brings us to the part of equality that is there. Enjoy the right to equality. So there are concepts of equality like formal equality and substantive equality, which I'm presuming that you might have read. And if you haven't, then to give you a very brief idea, formal equality means just a namesake equality, that everyone is equal in the eyes of law. That is formal equality. And substantive equality means that you have to bring everyone at par with each other. That is substantive equality. So when we give reservation, that's an affirmative action, to persons with disability, we talk about substantive equality. That we have to treat equals as equals. People who have been wrong at a lot of other number of times have to be put right equally with others who have been given advantages or who have gotten advantages because of their caste in the situation, or let's say gender. So you have to give them a substantive equality. You talk about non-discrimination. So non-discrimination has two aspects. One is that you do not discriminate against the persons who are disabled. You give them jobs equally. If there is an interview, a lot of places now keep on this clause of equal employer, equal pay employer. Basically, that means that there is non-discrimination, whether you are from any gender, whether you hail from any gender, whether you're disabled, or whether you had any allegiance to any group earlier. So that is non-discrimination. And affirmative action would mean that you give them a step ahead, so that now they are equal and now they can do good to the wrongs that were done to them. We come to the next part of women and children with disabilities. So we have concepts of multiple and intersectional discrimination. Now what I mean by that is, if a person is having a disability because of the environmental barriers that we have made, plus he hails from a particular gender, or he's because of age, he's more vulnerable. So there is multiple discrimination or intersectional discrimination that the person will be facing. A child with disability in this situation might first be denied of his rights. Second, since he's a child, majority of his decisions might just be questioned because of want of his age, want of maturity. And then he's a disabled person. Thereafter, these choices are more questions. Those are multiple discrimination that the person might face. Another example would be for women with disabilities. Women normally face a lot of the feminist approaches. The feminist jurisprudence talks about the discrimination that women has faced. That just multiplies if you are a person or if you are a woman with disability. And by that, what I mean is the women's choices have been negated for a long time. Again, in interiors, still in interiors, that's a very normal situation. Let's say even urban scenarios, that women do not have say in their own marital alliances. Whom do they want to marry? They do not have a say in it. Plus, if you are a woman who is having a disability, one, you do not have a say because of being a woman. Second, you do not have a say because you're already disabled. How are you supposed to make choices for yourself? And that's the entire thought process. Those are multiple and intersectional discrimination that the people might be facing. Now, these discriminations can be again taken into account by four very broad categories. One is direct discrimination. We will not give jobs to females. That's a direct discrimination. Or we will not get, we do not have washrooms. We do not have washrooms in urban scenarios. So that's again a discrimination because sanitation is an essential right and that cannot be fulfilled for women and also for males. But for a woman who is suffering from disability, the situation becomes more aggravated, right? There can be denial of reasonable accommodation. And what do I mean by that? For example, a woman needs to go for a mammogram and the hospital does not have services like that. That is a denial of reasonable accommodation. A woman who's on wheelchair wants to go for a mammogram. Now, first, the hospital needs to have services for mammogram. Then there needs to be a situation wherein a ramp or maybe a lift when the female with wheelchair can access that hospital. If that is not a scenario, then that's a denial of reasonable accommodation. There can be structural systematic discrimination also, which is a very common scenario when it comes to people or persons with disability, but it just gets aggravated when it comes to women and children with disability. Specifically when it comes to children who face intellectual disabilities or people who face intellectual disabilities. There is gradually, I really condemn that practice actually. This entire practice of having section A, section B based on the marks that you have got. That's not an inclusive way of education. That's more of structural and systematic discrimination. Denial of admission based on your marks, not in colleges I'm talking about, but in, let's say, at a lower education level, at higher secondary level, would be a discrimination that the person is facing. And that is coupled because there are, let's say, no ramps in the class, we do not have audiovisual aids in the class. So those are systematically and structural discrimination that we talk about. There is another concept called as accessibility. So, sorry, just to explain accessibility, even before going on to the slide, would be that the information is accessible to all. You and I, if we can read a newspaper, we can know the governmental policies. We can always go and approach our bank or whosoever is the authorized person for our rights. for, let's say, resources. But if a person is unable to know about government and policies, how will he be able to access them? That's a denial of his basic rights to him. If the infrastructure is made in such a manner that he or she cannot actually go ahead and access the schemes made for him, that is again a denial of his rights to him. So accessibility is the stepping stone for achieving all the rights. One of them being quality, another one being right to life. If the services are not accessible for you, then you cannot actually enjoy or achieve your rights. That's one thing. Also, we might just come across, or you might just hear person with disability saying that had we made this infrastructure, we would have always kept this in mind that tomorrow anyone else can be disabled. Or today, if we make an infrastructure, we will make it for us and you both. It will not just be for able-bodied like you. It will be for us also. People who use ramps, people who use sticks to navigate through, it will be for us also. So that's entire concept that whenever we are making an infrastructure, it should not have human built barriers. It should rather be an infrastructure that is accessible for all. The information should be available in all formats like braille, audiovisual aids, so that people who want to access it, they can access it. There should be sign language interpreters also everywhere possible. It should not be a situation wherein you're in education institution when you're actually denying admission to someone because of absence of information and technology, audiovisual aids. That's what should not happen. Our customs. So societal barriers are also form a part of not making it accessible or denying accessibility to persons with disability. One of them being customs. So a lot of customs in the Indian scenario actually deny persons with disability certain rights. Moving on, so even our legislation has a lot of provisions that we talk about accessibility. Section 42 start with talks says that it's the duty of the state to ensure, or the appropriate government, as rightly said in this legislation, to ensure that all the things are accessible. The transport is accessible, the information communication is accessible, the infrastructure is accessible to persons with disability. It then goes on into 41, 42, 43, and so on to talk about what all should be made accessible, what all needs to be made accessible, the earlier infrastructure, and it just fixes a time for it. In section 41, it says that the bus stops, railway stations, airports, parking spaces, toilets, ticketing counters, and ticketing machines should be made accessible for persons with disability. Now, it could have multifaceted meanings to it. If one sits and if he tries to understand what experience a wheelchair bound person would feel on a bus stop while trying to get in a bus which does not have a pedestal or which has a step. That's a very humiliating condition. Two people will come down, pull up the wheelchair, put him in the bus, and then while he has to come out again, two people will come, put him down from the bus, and then he can do something. So we need to make our already existing infrastructure in a manner, also amend, customize the already existing infrastructure in a manner that's accessible to everyone. Similar is the situation with respect to information and communication. That our content should be available in audio, print, and electronic media. There should be universal design for the goods. Whenever we make any uh, product, it should have a design which is accessible for everyone, anyone who might be facing any manner of disability. A person who is visually impaired should be able to use a laptop, and thankfully now we have laptops which are braille encrypt on it. So people who have visual impairment can use it. So that is the universal design of goods that we are actually talking about. And this brings us to another aspect, as I initially mentioned, that is disability is a very huge field in itself. So we have this entire concept called as Goldilocks dilemma. That what genre of disability, to what extent the person is disabled, whether he's disabled to an extent to be offered affirmative action or security, or whether he's not even disabled enough. Mental disability is another genre which is not taken care of when it comes to the entire society. So we had legislations from 1858 to 2017 wherein we have tried to talk about mental disability. And we have evolved in due course of time. And that's a huge discussion that we can get into, which we will at some other point of time. But just to give you a brief just to give you a brief view of this, when we talk about mental disability, it's a lex specialis. That means it has a special legislation for itself called as the Mental Health Care Act 2017. So people with mental disability are not governed or are not taken care of under the 2016 legislation of the rights of persons with disability. We have a different legislation altogether for it. And we have concepts such as stigma, blanket incompetence labeling, institutional care, objects of charity that we associate with mental disability, which to a certain extent obviously are not right, but we have a different genre of discussion that we can entail on this aspect. But I would like to restrict and end my slide on this note that all of us are potentially disabled. So tomorrow, whenever we think of any infrastructure, any services that we want to provide, or we have been providing for such a long time, we should always be sensitive towards the needs of persons with disability, because tomorrow we can be the one who are in their shoes. We could be the one who would require assistance. And to better that, it's better that we make our infrastructure in a manner that we can further the concept of independent living and not being dependent on anyone else. Thank you so much for this giving this opportunity to share my thoughts on this. I'll actually take a few questions right now, which have come in the chat box. So I think we were here. Most persons with disabilities have lots of questions about potential benefits they can apply for or to make up for the lost wages. Is there any possible way for the potential wages? Okay, this is a very confusing question at the outset. So I would like to break this question to give you an answer. As I was saying that there are a lot of schemes by government, central government, by the state government, by ministries, which give assistance to persons with disability. That's another genre of discussion, whether those schemes are in a format which is accessible for all or not, as I was talking about, whether we can actually avail those schemes or not. But we have schemes. We have Ministry of, again, persons with the disability empowerment committees. We have the Young Ministry. So these do lay out a lot of policies, and you can approach them every now and then for if you are being wronged at certain points, if you want certain assistance from them. So those are the options available to you. Someone had asked me about my point of view on the key changes required in the law. So, honestly speaking, I don't think I would suggest any key changes required in the law. Rather, I would suggest that whatever law we have right now, it's a utopian law that we have. And when I say utopian, because it's something that we want to achieve. That's a utopian law that right now. It's the best situation possible. So we have planned for what's it. We have a law which, if we are able to implement in next even 20 years, it's a good deal to achieve. So we have one of the best legislations right now. What we require is a great implementation of that legislation. What we require is awareness among people, among citizens like you and me, so that the legislation could be implemented in a better manner. So I don't suggest any key changes in the law. Rather, I suggest a good, efficient implementation of the present law. Okay, so there is a question that how does mental disability abets a person to commit suicide? That's so. You just got me to a point where I need to tell you something very important when it comes to mental disability. Mental disability is just not restricted to depression. Depression is a small, tiny component of all the things that we talk about in mental disability. So, a person trying to commit suicide is definitely suffering from some other mental disability, and that person is required to be given assistance, medical assistance, as per the present Mental Health Care Act. Earlier times, trying to commit suicide was a punishable act under IPC, which has now been, which I think was a very wrong precedent and a very wrong provision in the IPC, which has been remedied now and repealed, because of which the Mental Health Care Act now gives you an option, not an option, but rather a person who has tried to commit suicide needs to be given or should be given medical help. That is actually mentioned. Someone had asked me what law, because the constitution doesn't mention disabled persons too much, what law would I like to pass for the welfare of disabled persons? So I guess it's Divya. So Divya, I would like to answer your question by saying that we already have a law, not our law, we already have a good amount of laws existing in the country. We have laws for persons with disability also, protecting their rights also. Our 17 and 16 legislation coupled with our Mental Health Care Act 2017 actually protects their rights. So it is not required that we have another law. But yeah, it is very disheartening to see that the fathers of our constitution, the framers of our constitution, could not actually foresee or could not comprehend the inclusion of this segment of people while framing the constitution. So that as a law student, I feel very disheartening. Job opportunity being very less for persons with disability in the government sector. To be honest, I'm not really sure about those stats. That how many jobs, because there is reservation for persons with disability in the government sector, and as far as my understanding goes, not all the times are those vacancies filled. So if you say that there are less vacancies, that can be a situation, but the already existing vacancies are also not filled. So that's there always a vacancy. They are left vacant. So that's also another situation. How do we possibly increase the job vacancies in future? I think more than that, we should increase the skill development of persons with disability. We should have inclusive education. So instead of working on the top, I rather believe that we should be working at the basic level, that's education and skill development. So if that is there, jobs will not be a problem. Reservation is just a mode. Maybe that's not even required in future, and that's me just being optimistic. I guess that's all the queries that I had. If there are more, then I'll be happy to address them.
I have one for you, Isha.
Please go ahead, Samson sir.
So, I mean, that's something which is at a very basic level. You talk about a central act or a central legislation which deals about this particular issue of disability, right? Do you not think, or what's your opinion on the on the specific state government legislations which should be more into practice and work so that you address those issues at a very regional level, because it's seen that at a central level it becomes very difficult for the government to codify or uniform set of law which would be applicable throughout the country. What is your opinion on that?
So Shantanu sir has actually pointed that out. This, as I was saying initially, are both the legislation 16 and 17 are a product of our being signatory to the United Nations Convention. So we obviously, by the matter of policy, could not leave it to the state to make the law. Center had to replicate the signatory, the international legislation into the domestic legislations. I would not suggest the states coming up with the law, but the states can come up with rules, right? For implementing the very same act, they can come up with their specific state rules. They can come up with their specific state policy documents, which will be part of a delegated legislation, and they can be very effectively be applied by the state without any intervention of the center. So that can be a way, because now that we have a central act into picture, we cannot repeat it. And with the central act,
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was actually, I was meaning the same when I say that there's no use of a unified code, central level legislation. But yes, but I was just, as you rightly said, it become very difficult. But if you just look at it as on a very practical level, I think state governments, if not through an act, but through rules or regulations or through delegated legislation should play a major part wherein they would be in the best person to realize and overcome those hindrances which are at a very basic level, which become very difficult for the central to what I mean intervene or do it on that. Yes.
you are absolutely right on that, because center cannot understand the demography of a state. So in a state, there can be different issues the state is facing with respect to person with disability.
Exactly.
So you are right that we should, or the state should come up with policy documents or delegated legislation. But unfortunately, they are just an indivisible set of people. They are not the vote bank. So people do not go ahead trying to lure them, come up with benefits for person with disability. That's the worst situation. That's what I said in the first part of my presentation. That in spite of everything, they still are the invisible segment of people. So the state should do it, but when will they do it? They just can't be better about it.
Thank you
Maybe
so
we
very
just
much.
have a proposal to the state.
That can be. Thank you so very much, Isha. Do we
Thank
have
you.
any other questions? I request all the participants to fill up the form, feedback form, if you have not done that. That was already given at the middle of the session. Any other questions if we are there?
Someone has asked me another question, which I did not address. It says that in current COVID situations, mentally disabled persons are pushed into suffering due to continuous lockdown. Well, Divya, honestly speaking, it's just not mentally disabled persons. All of us are being pushed into corner while in the COVID situation due to some or the other reason. I do agree it might aggravate for persons who are suffering from depression or other mental disabilities. It is true, but we have sessions going on. Medical experts are trying to come up with ways to curtail depression being happening because of this lockdown. We're trying to figure out our ways. Everyone's trying to do their best in this aspect.
Okay, Isha, thank you so much for actually taking out time from your busy schedule and addressing all the questions almost. I mean, if something has been left out, then I don't think so you have left out any of the questions, but that's very generous of you that, you have taken out so much of precision that, you read through the questions and you are answering that. Generally, it doesn't happen all the time. So everything I also wanted to know something about the impact of COVID to this, and which you have already addressed right now. Before parting our ways and Tushara doing a final wind up, I would want to know your final thoughts on whatever today's discussion, interactive session, whatever your final thoughts before parting.
Yeah, so it was, thank you, Ruchi, first of all. for actually inviting me here. And it's so great to actually address students once again. And thank you, Shantanu sir, because it's good to see you.
Our pleasure to have you here. Yeah.
uh, I would have loved to have this interaction in person with students, because that's a different genre of interaction and engagement than that you have with the students. Nonetheless, webinar is a nice medium. Doing it from the comforts of our home, that's another good thing. So thank you so much for having me here, and I hope to have this discussion, or maybe have another discussion on disability rights itself in person with the students.
Sure, sure, sure. That will be our pleasure to host you actually here at Chettinad. So Tushara, I think we can go ahead and wind up the session because it's already, we are already running behind time. Okay, please.
I'm sure everyone who has tuned in here till this last moment has learned a lot from this session. I personally have gained a lot of many useful information about this particular topic. Thank you so much, ma'am. Here we comes to the end of this webinar session. Thanks to everyone who has tuned in. Do tune in to our future webinar sessions. Please look at our website and social medias like Facebook, Instagram, so that you can get our upcoming future webinar sessions. Thank you, everyone.